Welcome back to Footnotes and Folly, and to Herodotus. I am Pemberton. This is part 31. The loose ends of the revolt are gathered up. Histiaeus, the man who set it all going, is run down at last and put to death, and his head sent salted to the king, who is sorry, for he had liked him. The Persians net the conquered islands, man by man. Then Darius' son-in-law Mardonius leads a great new expedition into Europe, only to lose half his fleet, dashed to pieces by a storm off the cliffs of Mount Athos. And the king sends heralds the length of Greece to demand earth and water, the tokens of submission, and many give them, Edina among them, which sets Athens and Sparta moving. Let us continue.
So matters turned out in this way. Meanwhile Histiaeus the Milesian was at Byzantium, seizing the merchant ships of the Ionians, as they sailed out of the Pontus, when he received the report of what had happened at Miletus. At once he entrusted the affairs of the Hellespont to Bisaltes, son of Apollophanes, a man of Abydos, while he himself sailed with the Lesbians to Chios. When a body of Chians who were on guard would not allow him to approach, he fought with them at the place in Chian territory called the Hollows. Histiaeus not only killed many of them, but also used Polichon of the Chians as his base, and with the help of the Lesbians, he conquered the rest of the Chians as well, since they had suffered very heavily in the sea battle. Perhaps heaven is accustomed to give signs beforehand whenever great evils are about to happen to a city or a race of men, and before these events remarkable signs had come to the Chians too. First, when they had sent a chorus of 100 youths to Delphi, only 2 returned home. The other 98 were seized by a plague and carried off. Then, about the same time in their city, shortly before the sea battle, while some children were being taught in school, the roof fell in on them, so that out of 120 children only 1 escaped. These were the signs that God showed them beforehand. After this the sea battle came upon them, and brought their state down upon its knees, and because the Chians had suffered such great losses, Histiaeus conquered them without difficulty. From there Histiaeus made an expedition against Thasos, taking with him a large force of Ionians and Aeolians. While he was encamped around the town of Thasos, a report came to him that the Phoenicians were sailing up from Miletus to conquer the rest of Ionia. When he learned this, he left Thasos unconquered and hurried back to Lesbos himself, taking his whole army with him. Then, because his army was short of food, he crossed over from Lesbos to reap the grain in Atarneus, and also the grain in the plain of the Caicos, which belonged to the Mysians. In these parts there happened to be a Persian named Harpagos, commanding a considerable force. This man fought a battle with Histiaeus after he had landed, took Histiaeus himself prisoner, and destroyed the greater part of his army. Histiaeus was captured in this way. The Hellenes were fighting with the Persians at Malene, in the district of Atarneus, and after they had been engaged in close combat for a long time, the cavalry finally charged and fell upon the Hellenes. In fact, the cavalry decided the battle. So when the Hellenes had been put to flight, Histiaeus, trusting that the king would not put him to death because of his present offense, was seized by a desire to live. When a Persian caught him as he fled, and was about to run him through at the moment of capture, Histiaeus spoke in Persian, and made himself known, saying that he was Histiaeus the Milesian. Now if, after being taken prisoner, he had been brought to King Darius, I do not think he would have suffered any harm. Darius would have forgiven the charge against him. But for that very reason, and so that he might not escape punishment and become powerful again with the king, Artaphernes the governor of Sardis and Harpagos, who had captured him, put him to death at Sardis as soon as he arrived there on his way to the king. They impaled his body, but embalmed his head and brought it up to Darius at Susa. When Darius was informed of this, he found fault with those who had done it, because they had not brought Histiaeus alive into his presence. He ordered that the head of Histiaeus be washed, properly cared for, and then buried, as the head of a man who had been a great benefactor both to the king himself and to the Persians. Such was the end of Histiaeus. Meanwhile the Persian fleet had wintered near Miletus. When it put to sea again in the following year, it conquered without difficulty the islands lying near the mainland, Chios, Lesbos, and Tenedos. Whenever the barbarians took one of the islands, as each was conquered, they swept its inhabitants off it. They do this in the following way. They spread themselves from the sea on the north to the sea on the south, each man holding the hand of the next, and then they passed through the whole island, hunting the people out of it. They also took the Ionian cities on the mainland in the same manner, except that they did not sweep off the inhabitants in this way, because that was not possible. Then the Persian commanders proved that the threats they had made against the Ionians, when the Ionians were encamped opposite them, had not been false. For when they conquered the cities, they chose out the most handsome boys and castrated them, making them eunuchs, and they carried off the fairest maidens by force to the king. Not only this, but they also burned the cities together with the temples. Thus the Ionians had been reduced to slavery for the 3rd time, first by the Lydians, and then twice in succession by the Persians. Departing from Ionia, the fleet went on to conquer all the places of the Hellespont on the left as one sails in, for those on the right had already been subdued by the Persians themselves, who approached them by land. The cities of the Hellespont in Europe are these. First comes the Chersonese, where there are many cities, then Perinthos, the strongholds of the Thracian border, Selymbria, and Byzantium. The people of Byzantium and the people of Chalcedon opposite did not even wait for the Persian ships to arrive. They had already left their own land and departed, going inside the Euxine, where they settled in the city of Mesembria. So the Phoenicians, after burning the places just mentioned, next directed their course to Proconnesus and Artake. After they had delivered these also to the flames, they sailed back to the Chersonese to destroy the remaining cities that they had not sacked when they touched there before. Against Cyzicus, however, they did not sail at all, because even before the Phoenicians sailed in, the men of Cyzicus had submitted to the king of their own accord and made terms with Oeber son of Macabazos, the Persian governor at Daskylion. In the Chersonese, then, the Phoenicians made themselves masters of all the other cities except the city of Cardia. Until that time these cities had been ruled by Miltiades son of Cimon, son of Stesagoras, as despot. Miltiades son of Kypselos had obtained this rule in the following manner. The inhabitants of this Chersonese were Doloncian Thracians. These Doloncians, being hard-pressed in war by the Absinthians, sent their kings to Delphi to consult the oracle about the war. The Pythian prophetess answered that they must bring into their land, as founder of a settlement, the man who first offered them hospitality as they returned from the temple. The Doloncians then traveled along the sacred road through the land of the Phocians and the Boeotians. Since no one invited them in, they turned aside and came to Athens. At that time in Athens the government was held by Pisistratos. But Miltiades son of Kypselos also had some power. He belonged to a family that maintained 4 horse chariot teams, and he was originally descended from Iolcos and Aegina, though in more recent times his family was Athenian. Philios son of Adax had been the first of his house to become an Athenian. This Miltiades was sitting at the entrance of his own dwelling when he saw the Doloncians passing by, dressed in clothing that was not native Athenian fashion and carrying spears. He called out to them, and when they approached, he offered them lodging and hospitality. They accepted, and after he had entertained them, they told him all the utterances of the oracle. After telling him this, they asked him to do as the god had said. When Miltiades heard it, he was immediately inclined to agree, because he was vexed by the rule of Pisistratos and wished to be removed out of the way. So he set out at once for Delphi to ask the oracle whether he should do what the Doloncians asked of him. Since the Pythian prophetess also told him to do so, Miltiades son of Kypselos, who before this had been victor at Olympia with a 4-horse chariot, now took with him every Athenian who wished to share in the expedition, sailed with the Doloncians, and took possession of the land. Those who had invited him made him despot over them. First he built a wall across the isthmus of the Chersonese, from the city of Cardia to Pactae, so that the Absinthians would not be able to invade the land and damage it. The distance across the isthmus at this point is 36 furlongs, and from this isthmus inward the Chersonese is altogether 420 furlongs long. After he had built a wall across the neck of the Chersonese, and in this way driven back the Absinthians, Miltiades first made war on the people of Lampsacos. The people of Lampsacos laid an ambush and took him prisoner. Now Miltiades had become a friend of Croesus the Lydian, and when Croesus learned what had happened, he sent and ordered the people of Lampsacos to release Miltiades. If they did not, he threatened to destroy them utterly like a pine tree. The people of Lampsacos were perplexed in their discussions about what Croesus meant by this threat, that he would destroy them utterly like a pine tree. At last one of the older men perceived the truth, though with difficulty, and said that the pine alone of all trees, when it has been cut down, does not put forth any further growth, but perishes utterly. The people of Lampsacos therefore feared Croesus, released Miltiades, and let him go. In this way he escaped by means of Croesus. Later he came to the end of his life without leaving a son to succeed him, and he passed his rule and his possessions to Stesagoras, who was the son of Cimon, his brother on his mother's side. The people of the Chersonese still offer sacrifices to him after his death, as is customary for a founder, and they hold in his honor a contest of horse races and athletic exercises, in which no man of Lampsacos is allowed to compete. After this there was war with the people of Lampsacos, and Stesagoras too happened to die without leaving a son. He was struck on the head with an axe in the city hall by a man who pretended to be a deserter, but who proved in fact to be an enemy, and a very violent one. After Stesagoras had ended his life in this way, Miltiades son of Cimon, the brother of that dead Stesagoras, was sent in a trireme to the Chersonese to take possession of the government by the sons of Pisistratos. They had treated him well at Athens too, pretending that they had had no share in the death of his father Cimon. How that happened I will set out in another part of the history. When Miltiades came to the Chersonese, he kept himself inside his house, apparently paying honors to the memory of his brother Stesagoras. The leading men of the inhabitants of the Chersonese in every place, informed of this, gathered themselves together from all the cities and came in a body to condole with him. When they came, he had them put in chains. Miltiades then took possession of the Chersonese, maintaining a force of 500 mercenary troops, and he married Hegesippyle, the daughter of Oloros, king of the Thracians. This Miltiades, son of Cimon, had only lately returned to the Chersonese, at the time of which we are speaking. After his return, other misfortunes befell him, worse than those he had already suffered. 2 years before this he had been a fugitive from the land because of the Scythians. The nomad Scythians, provoked by King Darius, had all joined together and marched as far as the Chersonese, and Miltiades had not waited for their attack, but had fled from the Chersonese. At last the Scythians departed, and the Doloncians brought him back again. These things happened 2 years before the calamities that now pressed upon him. Now when Miltiades learned that the Phoenicians were at Tenedos, he filled 5 triremes with the property he had at hand and sailed away for Athens. Setting out from the city of Cardia, he sailed through the Gulf of Melis. As he passed along the shore of the Chersonese, the Phoenicians fell in with his ships. Miltiades himself escaped to Imbros with 4 of the ships, but the 5th ship was captured in the pursuit by the Phoenicians. It happened that this ship was commanded by Metiachos, the eldest of the sons of Miltiades, born not from the daughter of Aloros the Thracian, but from another woman. The Phoenicians captured him together with his ship, and when they learned who he was, that he was the son of Miltiades, they brought him up to the king. They thought they would earn great gratitude for themselves, because it was Miltiades who had given the Ionians his opinion that they should do what the Scythians asked, at the time when the Scythians requested them to break up the bridge of boats and sail away to their own land. But when the Phoenicians brought Metiachos son of Miltiades up to Darius, Darius did him no harm. On the contrary, he did him much good. He gave him a house, possessions, and a Persian wife, by whom he had children who were counted as Persians. Meanwhile Miltiades came from Imbros to Athens. During this year the Persians did nothing further that tended toward conflict with the Ionians, but the following things, done in that year, were very much to the Ionians' advantage. Artaphernes, the governor of Sardis, sent for envoys from all the cities and compelled the Ionians to make agreements among themselves, so that they would give satisfaction for wrongs and not plunder one another's land. This he forced them to do. He also measured their territories by parasangs, which is the Persian name for a distance of 30 furlongs. By these measures, then, he measured the lands and appointed a fixed amount of tribute for each people. This tribute has continued unchanged from that time even to my own day, just as Artaphernes appointed it. The amount of tribute appointed for each was nearly the same as it had been before. These were things that tended toward peace for the Ionians. At the beginning of spring, after all the other commanders had been removed by the king, Mardonius son of Gobryas came down to the sea, bringing with him a very large land army and a very large naval force. He was a young man and had lately married Artazostra, daughter of King Darius. When Mardonius led this army to Cilicia, he himself went aboard a ship and continued with the fleet, while other leaders led the land army to the Hellespont. Sailing along the coast of Asia, Mardonius came to Ionia. Here I shall relate something that will greatly astonish those Hellenes who do not believe that Otanes declared to the 7 Persians his opinion that the Persians ought to have popular rule. Mardonius deposed all the despots of the Ionians and established popular governments in the cities. After doing this, he hastened on to the Hellespont. When a vast number of ships and a large land army had gathered there, they crossed the Hellespont in the ships and began to make their way through Europe. Their route was directed against Eretria and Athens. These cities, I say, provided the stated pretext for the expedition, but the Persians had it in mind to subdue as many of the Hellenic cities as they could. First, with their ships, they subdued the Thasians, who did not even raise a hand to defend themselves. Then with the land army they added the Macedonians to those already serving them, for all the nations east of the Macedonians had already become subject to them before this. Crossing from Thassos to the opposite coast, they proceeded along near the land as far as Acanthos. Starting from Acanthos, they attempted to sail around Mount Athos. But as they were sailing around it, a violent north wind fell upon them, against which they could do nothing, and it handled them very roughly, casting a great many of their ships onto Mount Athos. It is said that the number of ships destroyed was 300, and that more than 20,000 men perished. Since the sea around Athos is very full of sea monsters, some were seized by these and died, others were dashed against the rocks, some did not know how to swim and perished for that reason, and others died from the cold. So it went with the fleet. Meanwhile Mardonius and the land army, while encamped in Macedonia, were attacked at night by the Brygian Thracians. Many of the Persians were killed by the Brygians, and Mardonius himself was wounded. Even so, the Brygians did not escape being enslaved by the Persians, for Mardonius did not leave that region until he had made them subject. But after he had subdued them, he led his army back, since he had suffered heavy loss with his land army in the fighting against the Brygians, and with his fleet in the voyage around Athos. So this expedition departed back to Asia, having gained no honor by its struggles. In the next year after this, Darius first sent a messenger to the men of Thassos, who had been accused by their neighbors of planning revolt, and ordered them to tear down the wall around their town and bring their ships to Abdera. The Thasians, because they had been besieged by Histiaeus the Milesian, and because at the same time large revenues were coming into them, had been using their money to build ships of war and surround their city with a stronger wall. Their revenues came from the mainland and from the mines. From the gold mines in Scaptile there came in, as a rule, 80 talents a year, and from the mines in Thassos itself a smaller amount than this. But still, in general, the Thasians, without taxes on the produce of their soil, had an annual revenue from the mainland and the mines amounting to 200 talents, and when it was at its highest, 300. I myself saw these mines, and by far the most marvelous of them were those discovered by the Phoenicians, who first settled this island in company with Thassos. From this Thassos the Phoenician the island has the name it now bears. These Phoenician mines are in the part of Thasos between the places called Enira and Conira, opposite Samothrace, where there is a great mountain that has been entirely turned up in the search for metal. So it was with this matter. At the command of the king, the Thasians both raised their walls and brought all their ships to Abdera. After this, Darius began to test the Hellenes, to see what they intended to do, whether they would make war against him or surrender themselves. He therefore sent heralds abroad, appointing some to go to one place and others to another throughout Hellas, and ordering them to demand earth and water for the king. These heralds he sent to Hellas. Meanwhile, he also sent other heralds to his own tributary cities along the sea coast, and he ordered them to build ships of war as well as vessels for carrying horses. They then were engaged in preparing these things. Meanwhile, when the heralds came to Hellas, many of those who lived on the mainland gave what the Persian demanded, and so did all the islanders to whom the heralds came with the demand. The islanders, I say, gave earth and water to Darius, and among them were the people of Aegina. When they had done this, the Athenians immediately pressed charges against them, believing that the Aeginetans had given with hostile intent against Athens, in order to make an expedition against them together with the Persians. The Athenians were also glad to seize an opportunity against them. Accordingly, they went back and forth to Sparta, accusing the Aeginetans of what they had done, on the ground that they had proved themselves traitors to Hellas.
And we will halt there, with half of Greece submitting to Persia and Athens crying treason against Aegina for it. Next time, in part 32, that quarrel drags in the two kings of Sparta, and Herodotus tells the strange, sad story of how Cleomenes bribed an oracle to unseat his fellow king Miletus, and of the terrible end Cleomenes came to for it. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.